And so to the second part of our talk, the should section, if you will, where we will explore some details of the origin and scientific achievements of this unique ship. Here we see three images. In the centre, the original construction of Discovery in a busy shipyard, actually just a few hundred yards along the Tay from its current location. Old Dundee shipbuilding, I'm afraid, now long gone. On left we show the polished mahogany of the wardroom where officers stayed. Cabins were small, but each man had his private space. It was learned in earlier polar expeditions that without privacy, arguments and strife soon came. Take note, anyone planning a Mars mission in the future. On the right, we show again the mushroom vents, the ankle bashers designed to afford some light and ventilation for lower decks, inconveniently located right in the centre of the walkway. So how did this project get going? Well, the origins of Discovery can be traced back to an earlier scientific expedition, the Challenger voyages of the 1870s, and one of the leaders of that started the ball rolling towards Discovery. So John Murray, now called the father of oceanography, gave an 1893 talk to the Royal Geographical Society, the RGS. Basically, he said, let's go find out what's in Antarctica. Send ships to both explore and do some science, extending early work of the 1840s, notably by Ross in Erebus and Terror, naming Ross Island, Ross Sea, and the ice shelf, which we will meet later on. So they knew something of the edges, but nothing of the interior in the 1890s. Time to set that right. Now, one man was paying attention, the chairman, Clement Markham, Sir Clement Markham, the RGS president, and he was inspired to set up a committee in 1895. He tried initially to get government funds, but they were modernising the Navy, so they said no, but they would provide 50% matching funds up to 45k. So off he went, and he got the money. By 1900, they had £90,000, around 4 million today, which sounds a lot, but really wouldn't get you this kind of result, I don't think. Anyway, a joint RGS and Royal Society project got going, science-driven. But who would lead it? Well, there was controversy. Murray himself resigned due to arguments. He wanted a scientist to run the whole thing. It was, after all, driven by two scientific societies. But the Navy did allow permission for naval officers to be selected, and they were decided to be the better option. And 10 candidates were considered, but Markham liked one in particular. Robert Falcon Scott, Captain Scott, considered an adventurous scientist with a very cool head, just what was needed. Now, originally he wanted 2 ships, exploring 2 different parts of Antarctica. But where to build them? Well, Norway was the obvious starting point. Nansen was there with experience on Fram, which is still there, by the way, in Oslo. But no existing ship satisfied Markham. And so the challenge was to build a wooden ship strong enough to overwinter in the south. And advice from home was, buy British, as we have already noted. Dundee steam whalers were a natural choice, and Discovery was born. Tenders were invited, 2 received, both from Dundee, and the cheapest was Dundee Shipbuilders Company coming in with a bid of about £44,000, which was left a lot of money for fittings and fixtures and fittings for the journey ahead. There followed a good and timely construction, but the final ship had a mainmast that was too short, so it was sluggish in low winds, and masts were in sub-optimum positions. All this was corrected in 1924, which is the ship we see now in Dundee. The focus instead was on strength, arguably the strongest wooden ship ever built. But despite the layers of timber, she suffered the Dundee leak. Even after being dry docked a few times, the source of the leak was never found. They just had to keep pumping out water all the time. Now, a science ship needed laboratories, and one of the most important was a magnetic laboratory midships. So no ferrous metal for 30 feet around there, and since the engines and boilers were situated aft, the crew had to live in an iron-free zone. No ferrous metal, as we have already noted, no springs in their mattresses, and even they had to put up with lead buttons on their cushions. All this came to a point on the 21st of March 1901, when the launch of the ship by Lady Markham, the steam yacht Discovery, not yet the RRS, that came later. Now, the science spec required met observations every 2 hours, quite a task, Also, many magnetic observations and frequent deep-sea dredging to recover biological specimens and sounding of depths, but also to explore the Ross Ice Shelf itself with dogs and sledge and study geology and volcanology of Mount Erebus. Quite the mixture. Then somebody had to go shopping for 3 years. The budget left 16,000 for provisions, generous indeed, so they ended up including a library with hundreds of books, 26 cases of champagne, and nearly £2,000 of tobacco. On deck they had 40 sheep and 20 dogs, a bad mixture, but also a balloon. Scott himself used this to observe the ice fields from 700 feet, a bird's eye view for the very first time. Now, of course, we see it every day, regularly monitored by satellites. All this left the UK after a royal visit in London on the 6th of August 1901, and by the end of the year her main purpose became clear. So let's go see her in her intended environment. And here is our main purpose: to be locked in ice, a floating laboratory. As part of the Discovery expedition running from August 1901 all the way through till September 1904, built to provide a base locked in the sea ice of Antarctica and to stay for 2 winters, enough time to explore and measure. So a long voyage from Dundee to get there, all via New Zealand, where they took on the sheep and howling dogs on the limited deck space. They eventually left New Zealand on Christmas Eve in 1901, and soon they met the ice, where one advantage of steam was they could approach ice walls much closer than previous sail ships. A first close look at the ice sheet. Also, as mentioned, the first view from above using a balloon flight. And by the 8th of February they were frozen into the sea ice of McMurdo Sound for winter quarters, where huts were then assembled and sledging expeditions planned in all directions. Winter came with darkness. The ship was described as being cosy, all light and bright, with no wind sounds, until a door was opened and hell was let in. But it was freezing cold in the ship with the boilers off. But by good design, each officer had his own small private space, and tempers did not fray, unlike earlier expedition, as already mentioned. Helped also, of course, by a series of lectures and shows put on by the crew. The dogs, all from Siberia, had a kennel built, but they preferred to sleep outside even in the coldest part of winter. Not all was good, though. An outbreak of scurvy caused some consternation, and on a long 93-day sledging expedition across the ice, many dogs died, and the men grew hungry enough to reportedly hallucinate jam tarts flying through the air. In the end, all the dogs died, and they had to pull the sledges themselves. The first extended trip into the continent, reaching 80 degrees south for the first time. But their science was initially frustrated when a chasm stopped them collecting rock samples at the edge of the ice sheet. Here was a conflict between their adventure and their science requirements. But they did espy the rocky shore of a new land, the edge of the ice sheet, the interior edge. But they quickly learnt, and on other expeditions in the second winter, they went into the mountains and glaciers to study the geology of the Transantarctic mountain range, helping to establish that Antarctica really is a single continent, a rocky landmass from which sea ice spreads as far north as the cold permits. So generally we have a much larger but thinner ice field than in the Arctic, and completely different to the North Pole, which of course is all sea ice. The extent and importance of the southern ice we now know is key to understanding global climate change. Disturbingly, 2023 is already the lowest summer sea ice coverage on record, and I'm recording this only in March. The trends are worrying for future climate change, and all this started with the work of the Discovery expedition. Indeed, they were the ones who first started to understand the importance of sea ice to us all, wherever we live on the planet. Freezing seawater at the surface of the ocean expels salt, making the water below denser, causing it to sink. And this is part of an engine that drives the great ocean conveyor, the mass movement of water that helps regulate energy in the global climate system. Sea ice is also hugely important for life at the poles. In the Antarctic, the algae that cling to the ice are a source of food for the small crustaceans known as krill, which, it was discovered by Discovery, are a basic food resource for whales, seals, penguins and other birds. The sea ice also, of course, provides a convenient platform for some species where they will haul out and rest. Eventually summer came. January 1903 saw a relief ship called Morning. She arrived with fresh supplies and room to take home some men. men, together with letters and reports on progress, and there was much interest back home following the adventures of Discovery. Then the crew settled down for a second winter in ice and more sledge expeditions involving frostbite, lost equipment, and saved only by close camaraderie and sharp improvisation. In particular, Scott, the leader, learnt a lot during these journeys. But when would they ever escape? Well, January 1904 came, and they took to making a sawing camp, trying to saw the ship free. But by now there was 20 miles of ice between them and the open ocean. Then 2 relief ships arrived on the 5th of January 1904. Morning came again, and another one from Dundee, Terra Nova. And after getting used to the broad Dundee accents of the crews, with orders to abandon Discovery, fresh supplies were first shipped to Discovery by sledge, despite trouble from killer whales swimming under the sledges and trying to break through the ice from below. Preparations were made to abandon the ship and leave it there. But 6 weeks of explosives helped blast a channel down to just 2 frustrating miles. Then, on Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, the wind changed and the ice began to break up, bringing the 3 ships together and a channel opened to the sea. But then, disaster. A gale came and the engines failed, almost dashing the ship on the ice. But again, it was saved by a last-minute change of current direction and a working engine. There must have been some frantic work in the boiler room at that time, and it finally freed the ship after 2 years in the ice. They all arrived in New Zealand on April the 1st, 1904, and then home via South America after more storms and rough seas, arriving back home on the 10th of September. Finally, there was a lecture in a sold-out Albert Hall in London by Scott himself, who was a nervous speaker, although a great leader of men. He gave that speech on the 7th of November 1904, and that brought the whole adventure to a halt. Now, the men who endured and discovered all this certainly had what you might call the right stuff, so we're going to go and meet some of them now. So here we have a cross-section of the crew, both adventurers and scientists, to give a flavour for what we call the right stuff needed for such an adventure. As mentioned, Robert Falcon Scott, this gentleman here, he was in overall charge of the expedition, action scientist as he was considered, but he was supported by dozens of men, of course, carrying out tasks from stoking the boilers to cooks and able seamen climbing the rigging. Selected as a mix of Royal and Merchant Navy professionals, as well as scientists. And one man in particular kept this disparate team together, and that was Ernst Shackleton, in charge of provisions and morale, although invalided home on the first supply boat in 1903, the morning, remember. His man management skills came to the fore in later expeditions, first in Nimrod in 1907-8, when he came very close to the South Pole, within 100 miles, and then more famously in the Endurance expedition in 1914, an attempt to walk across the whole continent. But when his ship got crushed, it was not built to the same spec as Discovery, I'm afraid. He found himself and all the crew on the sea ice. The crew camped on ice floes with 3 small boats and made for Elephant Island, and they lived in the upturned boats until Shackleton set off in one boat, the James Caird, whose name also sits on Dundee's largest building, the Caird Hall. And there followed an epic 700-mile journey to South Georgia, where he finally sent messages for help in May 1916. And amazingly, all the crew survived. And as a footnote, the Endurance, his ship, was recently found in Antarctica on the 5th of March 2022 at a depth of 3 kilometers in the Weddell Sea, which is the opposite side of the Antarctic continent from Discovery expedition. Now, in addition to the ship's crew, of course, there was a team of scientists and artists, like this guy, Edward Wilson, the ship's surgeon, a naturalist, and skilled watercolor painter. Here is one of his dramatic pictures of the Antarctic wilderness. He became a close and trusted friend of Scott, fatally as it turned out, because Wilson died with Scott and 3 others in the 1912 Terra Nova expedition, which succeeded to the South Pole, only to find the Norwegians had beaten them to it, and then they all died of cold on the return journey. And so to the science. Well, the youngest member of the team got the job of geologist, and here he is here. We got it by luck. It was originally going to be given to a full professor of some experience, but he pulled out, and in place went a raw graduate. But he was a top athlete at university, which must have been in his favour. His name was Hartley Ferrar, And what an opportunity. He was the first to seriously map the rock strata of this new continent, even finding coal deposits. And also he found fossilized plants, showing that Antarctica had once been covered with green, hinting at the movement of continents across the globe. Last to join in New Zealand was a physicist, Louis Bernacchi, an Australian, in fact, of Belgian-Italian stock, an expert on magnetic observations, a key skill set for the mission. But he was also selected because he had been on an earlier 1898 trip to Antarctica when he diffused many fights between the crew, a good calmer of men. The magnetic observatory was a key part of the original ship design, as we have already seen, and one of its main objectives was to map the Earth's magnetic field in the southern regions. Now, the first observation of the Earth's field itself was made, of course, by Carl Friedrich Gauss in 1835 using a sensitive magnetometer. But there were still large gaps in our understanding of the complexities of terrestrial magnetism, like where exactly was the South Magnetic Pole, not as you may think, simply related to the North Magnetic Pole. But not all crew choices were so good. They had a serious cook problem. The cook was a key member of the crew, of course, but the first, a Tasmanian, Henry Brett, proved to be so bad that he was put in irons in 1902 and sent home on the first opportunity, the first relief ship in 1903. Luckily, his number two, Charles Clark, was excellent and most days managed to bake fresh bread in the ship itself. So, on its return, what next for this weird ship? Well, eventually it was sold cheaply in 1905 to a commercial outfit, the Hudson's Bay Company, for about £10,000, and then quickly it was turned into a merchant ship, plying between London and the ice of Hudson's Bay. All scientific equipment was abandoned and space was made for cargo and more coal. It then made annual trips to Canada for 5 or 6 years, leaving in June each year and returning in October. So it seemed its science role was dead. Although she was called into duty in 1916 as a rescue ship for the Shackleton and his crew, but she proved too slow and only got as far as Buenos Aires before another ship rescued the Endurance crew. So she limped home again to continue wartime convoy work. After the war, she was too old even for such commercial work and was laid up in London from 1920 to 23, occupied by a single watchman, and at one stage HQ for Stepney Sea Scouts. But actually, Discovery was not done with science just yet. And if you're interested to find out more, stay with us for the final third